Hello friends. In my last lecture, I had emphasized that a proper study of literature requires an understanding of the historical, social, political, economic, cultural background of the society in which the literature was written, the piece of literature that was written. In that connection, if you wish to study English literature, you should be aware of the developments in British history. In that connection, I talked to you about one of the greatest monarchs in British history, that was Henry VII. Why was Henry VII, or why is Henry VII so important for us? Henry VII is important because he marks, in a way, the end of the Middle Ages. When I say the end of the Middle Ages, let's remember that no age passes away at a certain point of time. We go, just as we grow from childhood to maturity to old age, slowly, silently, quietly, unobservedly, as it were, so does the history of a nation and the changes take place very quietly, very unobtrusively. Henry VII's reign marks the end of the Middle Ages and, in a way, the beginning of the Renaissance. We don't quite feel the beginning of the Renaissance so much as the end of the Middle Ages. You would recall that Henry VII became monarch on the field of Bosworth in 1485 when he defeated Richard III. Henry, that is Henry VII, did not have a better claim to the throne than 10 other persons living at that time. We would talk about them, but let's go back to what the situation that prevailed in England at that time. The war, the battle that was fought at Bosworth, was not the last of the War of the Roses, that is, the war between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Henry VII belonged to the House of Lancaster. He was son of Edward Tudor and Edmund Tudor, according to some historians. They were not a very significant family, but here was a man who had very clear insight, and the affairs of the state require people with clear insights. Historians have pointed out that Henry, for the 28 years of his life, previous life, that is before he became king, had lived for half of the time in Wales, and he was quite a Welshman. English historians such as Christopher Morris points out that the Welsh are somewhat poetic, superstitious, lover of music, but also people who have a very clear idea of what would suit them. They remember Glendower, who was quick to leave the side which was about to fall. Morris, that is Christopher Morris, uses the word fey for the Welsh, and in order to assess Henry VII's character, he says that he was courageous, almost to the point of despair, the type of courage that you see in a person who is about to face death. That is the kind of person that Morris characterizes Henry VII as. Let's have a look at what it actually meant for the English people. There is no country, wrote a Venetian envoy, there is no country in the world where there are so many thieves and robbers as in England. As I said, that due to the Wars of the Roses and also because of the powerful barons, it was difficult to maintain peace. The English monarchs were weak because they had no means to control the warring barons. The result was that industry did not prosper. Culture, as it were, was at a standstill. And when industry does not prosper, when trade does not flourish, then people don't find employment, and the only way left is to earn by crime. So there is no country in the world where there are so many thieves and robbers as in England, said a Venetian envoy to England. And Henry VII's reign is significant because he was able to control both the barons and the criminals. Once the barons' powers were put to rest, or at least brought under some degree of control, trade began to flourish, and people began to find employment, and income was generated for the common man. And that reduced the recurrence of crime in England. So Henry, after defeating Richard on Bosworth Field, married the daughter of Elizabeth IV. So married Elizabeth, daughter of Edward IV, who belonged to the House of York. However, he did not show that it was an important event, lest the Yorkists might claim some kind of say in the prerogatives and powers of the court. Having done that, Henry pursued mainly three goals in his statecraft. The first was to secure the throne for himself and his successors. The second was to strengthen the power of the crown by depressing the nobility. The third was to take an active interest in the European politics. By that, the prestige of England rose high, which also helped England's trade with the continent, and later England's trade with the rest of the world. This had a side effect of increase in the prosperity of the middle classes, because once the nobility could be put in check, they did not interfere with the activities of the common people. And on the other hand, when industry began to prosper, industry began to flourish, and the government became strong, lawlessness was checked. So, in order to pursue his first policy, that was strengthening his claim to the throne and strengthening it for his successors, he put Edward Plantagenet, who was who could have been one of the successors to the throne of England. He put Edward Plantagenet into the Tower. That was, he imprisoned him. Edward Plantagenet was son of Clarence and grandson of Earl of Warwick. Next, he induced John de la Pole, who was Earl of Lincoln, who was another possible successor to the throne. He induced John de la Pole to submission. John de la Pole had been acknowledged as the heir to his throne by Richard III, who lost on Bosworth Field. Later, Lincoln fled to the court of Margaret of Burgundy. Margaret was sister of Edward IV. You will remember that Elizabeth, his wife, was daughter of Edward IV. So here was Margaret of Burgundy, that is on the continent, who was a constant thorn on the side of Henry VII, because she was ever ready to support any Yorkist insurrection against Henry. She hated Henry, and she was ready to help any Yorkist uprising, any Yorkist adventurer against the throne. The first person whom she helped was Lambert Simnel. He was an Oxford boy, but he pretended to be Edward Plantagenet. You remember, Edward Plantagenet had been put into the Tower almost immediately after Henry ascended to the throne. And Edward Simnel knew that the Yorkists had been popular in Ireland. So he went to Ireland, and with the help of Irish and German mercenaries and people like Lincoln, that is John de la Pole, who was acknowledged as heir to Richard III, who lost on Bosworth Field. So with the help of Lincoln, Michael Schwartz and Lovell had been an old minister of Richard III. With the help of these people, they crossed the Channel and marched to London. However, he was checked at Stoke-on-Trent, and in 1487, that is only 2 years after Henry ascended the throne, he was defeated at Stoke-on-Trent, and he was made a scullion, that is a minor member of the royal kitchen. It was about this time that he sensed that the Yorkists had to be, the people from the House of York had to be pleased. And so Henry got his wife, Elizabeth, crowned Queen of England. She did not have much power, unlike William and Mary in the late 17th century. So Lambert Simnel became a kitchen boy. Thereafter, there was the uprising of Perkin Warbeck. Once again, he received help from Margaret of Burgundy, and he pretended to be Richard, Duke of York. Perkin Warbeck pretended to be Richard, Duke of York, that is younger brother of Edward V. And it was in that capacity that he claimed the throne. It was said that they had been killed by Henry VII in the Tower. Henry could not accept this in public, and until he denied it, he could not deny that Perkin Warbeck was not younger brother of Edward V, that is Richard, Duke of York. Both these persons were actually killed while in the Tower secretly, and this was discovered in the 17th century when two dead bodies, two skulls, the bones of these two persons were found which answered the description of them. In the meantime, Perkin Warbeck, who declared himself king in Ireland, as I said, that Ireland supported the House of York. And thereafter he went to France. And in France he was received warmly by the king. Henry had sent his troops to help the Duchess of Brittany, that is the northwest of France. And this had incensed the French king. So he in turn helped Perkin Warbeck. However, he did not receive much support from the French king either. So Perkin moved to Flanders, and there he lived for 3 years. From Flanders, in 1496, Henry signed a pact with the King of Flanders, which is called the Intercursus Magnus, or the Great Intercourse. Intercursus Magnus, or the Great Intercourse. This was to regulate the trade of wool and wine with that country. According to one of the articles of this agreement, the Flanders government was not supposed to assist Perkin Warbeck. Thereafter, Perkin Warbeck went to Ireland. From Ireland he went to Scotland, and in spite of the fact that Henry had given away his daughter Margaret in marriage to James IV, King of Scotland supported Perkin Warbeck, and for a time he was a nuisance for Henry because of the raids that he made in the northern part of England, in the northern counties of England. He did not gain much support and went back to Ireland, and thereafter we don't hear much of Perkin Warbeck. In 1497, there was an uprising in Cornwall. I told you about the assistance that James IV gave to Perkin Warbeck, and Perkin Warbeck saw that there was an uprising in Cornwall, and this was because Henry tried to levy taxes on the English people because he claimed that he was protecting them against the Scottish raids. But Warbeck was captured here in the war and was sent to the Tower, where he made friends with Edward Plantagenet. In 1499, Henry got rid of both Edward Plantagenet and Perkin Warbeck, and thus he made sure that there were no more pretenders to the throne of England. No one who had a better claim to the throne of England was alive. About 7 years later, that is early in the 16th century, Earl of Suffolk, younger brother of Lincoln. You remember we talked about John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who had been named heir of Richard III. And Richard III was the one who fell at Bosworth. So he had named John de la Pole heir to the throne. So his younger brother, Earl of Suffolk, submitted on the agreement, on the understanding that his life would be spared. Henry VII kept his word, but advised his son to get rid of him as soon as he ascended the throne. Henry VII died in 1509, and in 1513, Henry VIII, his son, got rid of Suffolk. In these ways, the Tudor monarchy was put on a stable basis at home. However, the second policy, the second main plank of Henry's policy was, as we pointed out earlier, to strengthen the crown's finances. Francis Bacon, who had written a life of Henry VII, said, "What he minded, he compassed." Francis Bacon had said about Henry VII, what he minded, he compassed. That is, whatever he thought of, whatever he first got an idea of, he made sure that he achieved it. Externally, Henry VII was a very sedate king, very quiet, composed, inoffensive in character. However, inwardly, he was very determined, perhaps even ruthless. And these things we see in his domestic policies. The most important thing was the appointment of Morton. As we said, that the first task was to depress the nobility, because on it depended the security of trade and commerce within the realm. On this security of trade and commerce depended Henry's finances. The Parliament had readily renewed Richard III's law against keeping retainers. That is, in 1484, Richard III got the Parliament pass a rule against keeping retainers, which meant that no baron could keep more than 300 liveried men. A livery is the clothes that you wear. A person who wears the clothes of a master are called a liveryman of the master. So he was, Richard III had got the Parliament pass a law against liverymen. And it was renewed when Henry VII came to the throne. Henry's tact lay not in the renewal of the law against liveries and retainers, but against its enforcement. He formed a new court to try the offenders whose crimes were too subtle or who were too powerful to be tried at the regular assizes. You would remember that these barons used to get juries of their choice empaneled so that they could get sentences of the court, the verdicts of the court in their favor. Now, Henry appointed a new court, which was later called the Court of Star Chamber. The Court of Star Chamber. And this court would try offenders whose crimes were too subtle, or who were offenders who were very powerful. The ordinary crimes were tried at the normal, regular assizes. He appointed the chief officers of the state to this Court of Star Chamber. Then he appointed several judges, and then he also appointed any others whom he found fit. It summoned offenders before and tried them without jury. This court summoned offenders on its own and tried them without jury, so that justice, that is justice which appeared to be proper and safe and in the interest of the crown, was done by this Court of Star Chamber. It says, the stout gentlemen of the north of England. Most of these powerful barons were in the north of England, and Henry tried to control them. Thereafter, he appointed Morton, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, as the Chancellor. And Morton devised a very interesting method of taxing people. If someone lived ostentatiously, if some of these nobles lived ostentatiously, then Morton would ask them to grant benevolences, that is forced gifts to the crown. Benevolences, that was what he called them. And if they lived thriftily, then he pointed out that they saved more money because of their thrift, and they could pay Henry, they could pay the crown from the money that they had thus saved. So this dilemma between spending and saving has been called Morton's Fork. And in this way, Henry's coffers were enriched. English historians have cited two significant cases in this connection. The first is that of Earl of Oxford. He had invited Henry to his court. Oxford had been one of the noted warriors on the Lancastrian side, that is his own side. However, when he passed through the line of liveries, he found that they were more in number than 300. That was the maximum that was allowed by the Statute of Livery and Maintenance passed in 1484. The Statute of Livery and Maintenance passed in 1484. These are your servants, said the king. Sir, they are my retainers, replied the lord. Thank you for your hospitality, my lord, said the king. But I cannot have my laws broken in my sight. And Oxford was made to pay £15,000 to the crown. You would remember that when Henry wanted to help John and Sebastian Cabot in going to America and with the British ships and sailors, he paid them only £10. So you can imagine what this amount of money must have been in the 15th century. The second case is that of Sir William Stanley, brother of Earl of Derby. The allegation against Stanley was that he had been corresponding with Perkin Warbeck. He was tried, executed, and Stanley was a very wealthy man, and all his wealth was confiscated for the royal treasury. Henry was not very scrupulous, as rarely a monarch can probably afford to be. And these were the ways in which he enriched himself. He demanded benevolences, he taxed the nobles, and he used his chancellor, that is Morton, to tax the nobles and offenders against the law. The Court of Star Chambers had two very eminent lawyers. One of them was called Empson and the other one was Dudley. Dudley wrote a famous book called Tree of Commonwealth. Tree of Commonwealth. It was published in 1509. He was very unpopular. Later on, Dudley and Empson became very unpopular. And Henry VIII, in order to please the people, beheaded Dudley. Henry VIII was much more ruthless, much more unscrupulous than his father. There is an interesting method by which Henry enriched his coffers. The Parliament was very happy to give him grants to fight the French. The English people were very envious of, very suspicious of the French people. And the Parliament was ever willing to vote new taxes, allow new funds to the king to go against France. Henry intelligently got the amounts passed by the Parliament. The news, however, reached France, and he advised the French king to give him, to satisfy him with gifts, with expensive gifts. And the French king also gave him wealthy presents, rich grants to contain him, to prevent him from attacking France. Henry kept the money that was passed by the Parliament and also that which he received from France, because his policy was that peace is always better than war. So we have seen two aspects of Henry's policies. The first was his attempt to secure the throne for himself and his successors, and the second was his decision, his desire, his commitment to enrich his coffers, because no king could become powerful with an empty treasury. Historians have given us figures for his reign. They have pointed out that when he first ascended the throne, the income from crown lands was 13,633 pounds. In the next 3 years, he raised it to 32,630 pounds, and it steadily increased to 52,000 pounds. And in the last 5 years of his reign, it averaged to 1,42,000 pounds per annum. Christopher Morris points out the crown, when he acquired it, was heavily in debt, and for some years he had to borrow money, but by 1492 he had repaid all his loans and could show a surplus in the royal accounts. From 1497 onwards, he was able to save really large annual sums, and at his death he left a balance credibly estimated as something in the region of £1.5 million. So this was the result of Henry's domestic policy. Henry knew that his domestic policy and his secure throne also depended to some extent on his prestige on the continent, on his prestige abroad. So he played and he took interest in the European politics of the time. The two powerful rivals on the continent were the French and the Spaniards. And both France and Spain had their eyes on states in Italy. On the other hand, Emperor Maximilian, who was in control of northern Italy, wanted to prevent any of these powers to gain control over Italy. And this relationship brought about maneuvers and alignments which shaped European history. Henry got his son Arthur, the heir to the throne, married to the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon, and this was in 1501, and she was Catherine of Aragon. However, soon after her marriage to his son Arthur, Arthur died, the prince died. A little later, even his wife Elizabeth died, that is Henry's wife Elizabeth died. And now appears the ugly side of Henry. He used the fact of the physical possession of Catherine to intimidate her. He also proposed his hand in marriage to her. When that did not work, then he got her married to Henry, who would later become Henry VIII. And it was thus that he wanted to play a role on the continent. But Henry's reign would be remembered not only for what he did, but also for many things that happened during that time. On the continent in 1442, Gutenberg, that is in Germany, Gutenberg established a printing press. It was soon to come to London, that is Westminster, where Caxton began printing his books, and one of the first ones, or one of the books that he printed was Malory's Morte d'Arthur, La Morte d'Arthur. Gunpowder was known, had come to Europe in the 14th century, and by the middle of the 14th century, England began to use gunpowder. By Henry's time, this had become quite a powerful weapon in the hands of the monarch. And earlier, the barons and the nobles who fought with spikes or bows and arrows now became things of the past. If you look at some of the paintings in the albums of the Mughal emperors, you would find people fighting with bows and arrows. So that was the type of thing that was happening in Europe even in the 16th century, early 16th century. But gradually, bows and arrows and spikes were giving way to the cannons. So, on the second hand, Constantinople had fallen in 1453. This had fallen to the Turks, as I pointed out to you in my earlier lecture. And scholars began to come to Europe with their books, and thus knowledge proliferated in Europe. So it was a time of great changes. The gunpowder, the compass, the seafarers, the sailors were changing the face of Europe. Europe economy was changing from the countries of the middle of the Mediterranean. They were going to in the hands of the countries on the shores of the Atlantic, countries like England, Holland, Spain, Portugal. These were the new countries that were becoming powerful. Henry VII's reign represents a time of great change from the Middle Ages to modern times, to the Renaissance. And it is for this reason that Henry's reign is remembered by the historians, and he had a far-reaching influence on the history of England. Thank you.